The grandfather clock in Uncle Richard's dining room had just chimed 7 when he stood up, wine glass in hand, and cleared his throat. The entire Morrison family turned to face him. 15 adults and 8 children gathered around the massive mahogany table that had hosted Christmas dinner for 3 generations. "Before we continue with dessert," Uncle Richard announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built Morrison Construction from a 2-man crew into the city's largest commercial builder, "I need to address some family business." I set down my fork, the bite of Mom's apple pie turning to ash in my mouth. At 28, I'd learned to recognize that tone. The same one Uncle Richard used when he was about to fire someone or terminate a contract. "As you all know," he continued, gesturing around the table, "Morrison Construction has been the foundation of our family's success for 40 years. It's provided good jobs for our men, funded our children's educations, and built the legacy we're all proud of." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. My cousins Michael and David nodded approvingly from their seats near the head of the table, both of them having been handed vice president positions straight out of college despite never having swung a hammer or read a blueprint. However, Uncle Richard's voice grew stern. "Some family members have chosen to pursue other interests instead of contributing to our shared success." Every eye in the room turned to me. I sat perfectly still in my simple black dress, the same outfit I'd worn to every family gathering for the past 3 years. While my female cousins wore designer clothes and expensive jewelry, I'd learned that understated appearance served my purposes better. "Sarah," Uncle Richard said, looking directly at me, "you've made it clear that you think you're too good for honest construction work. You've refused every opportunity I've offered you, preferring to waste your time with computers and consulting." The way he said consulting made it sound like a dirty word. Around the table, aunts and uncles shook their heads disapprovingly. Only my parents looked uncomfortable, though they remained silent. "Therefore," Uncle Richard announced, "effective immediately, you are cut off from any future involvement in Morrison Construction. No job offers, no financial support, no expectation of inheritance. You've chosen your path." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of children playing in the living room. I felt 15 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for my reaction. "I understand," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "Good," Uncle Richard said, sitting back down. "Maybe now you'll realize that family businesses require family commitment." Just as Aunt Margaret began passing around coffee cups, the doorbell rang. Uncle Richard frowned. Christmas dinner was family only and everyone was already here. "I'll get it," my cousin Michael said, pushing back from the table. Through the archway we could hear the front door opening and Michael's surprised voice. "Mr. Patterson, I didn't know you were coming tonight." "Sorry to interrupt Christmas dinner," came a familiar voice that made my pulse quicken, "but I was in the neighborhood visiting my own family, and I wanted to drop off these contracts for Richard to review." Uncle Richard stood up quickly, smoothing his shirt. "James, come in, come in. You're always welcome here." James Patterson entered the dining room and I had to suppress a smile. At 55, he was one of the most powerful commercial developers in the region, and Morrison Construction's biggest client. His company, Patterson Development, had provided nearly 40% of Morrison's revenue over the past 3 years. "Sorry to interrupt your family gathering," James said, his eyes scanning the table until they landed on me. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Uncle Richard's smile faltered as James walked directly toward my chair. "It's good to see you, Mr. Patterson," I said, standing to shake his hand. "Please, we've been through this. Call me James." He turned to address the entire table, his voice warm with admiration. "I hope you all realize how lucky you are to have Sarah in your family." Uncle Richard's face had gone pale. "I'm sorry, James, but I think there might be some confusion." "Confusion?" James looked genuinely puzzled. "About what?" She does some computer consulting work," Uncle Richard said weakly. James laughed heartily. "Computer consulting?" "Richard, Sarah is the CEO of Nexus Solutions. She's revolutionized project management software for the construction industry. Her company is worth over $2 billion. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my cousin David's fork hit his plate. "That's impossible," Michael said, his voice strangled. "Sarah doesn't, she can't." "Can't what?" James asked, his tone suddenly cooler. Can't build one of the most successful tech companies in the country? Because she absolutely has. I remained standing, feeling eerily calm as my family's worldview crumbled around them. For 3 years I'd sat at this same table while they treated me like the family disappointment. The niece who'd rejected honest work for frivolous pursuits. The young woman who drove a 10-year-old car and lived in a modest apartment while her cousins flaunted their inherited wealth. James, Uncle Richard said, his voice shaking slightly, surely you're thinking of someone else. I'm thinking of the woman who created the software that's increased Morrison Construction's efficiency by 30% over the past 2 years, James said firmly. The CEO who's been personally overseeing the technology integration for your biggest projects. Aunt Margaret dropped her coffee cup. The crash of china on hardwood seemed unnaturally loud. You mean? My cousin David started, then stopped, his mouth hanging open. I mean, James continued, that Sarah's company has been the silent partner behind Morrison Construction's recent success. The project management software, the automated scheduling systems, the client relationship databases, all Nexus Solutions products. He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to Uncle Richard. In fact, I was just reviewing the quarterly reports. Morrison Construction's productivity gains from Nexus software have saved your company approximately $1.2 million this year alone. Uncle Richard stared at the phone like it might bite him. But more importantly, James continued, Sarah has been personally consulting on our joint projects. The Riverside Complex, the Downtown Convention Center, the Medical District expansion. Sarah's been the project coordinator behind the scenes for all of them. That's not possible, my cousin Michael protested. We handled those projects. David and I were the lead coordinators. James's expression grew cold. Actually, you weren't. When Morrison Construction started missing deadlines and going over budget on our projects 2 years ago, I insisted on bringing in external project management. Sarah's team has been running coordination for every major project since then. The room was spinning. I could see my family members exchanging horrified glances as they began to understand the implications. The reason Morrison Construction has been so successful lately, James continued relentlessly, is because Sarah has been fixing the problems created by inexperienced management. But she never said anything, my mother whispered. Because I asked her not to, James replied. Sarah suggested that having a family member openly critiquing Morrison's operations might create tension. She preferred to work behind the scenes to ensure both companies' success. Uncle Richard finally found his voice. Sarah, is this true? I looked around the table at my family. The same people who'd spent years dismissing my work, questioning my choices, and treating me like a charity case they were obligated to tolerate. Yes, I said simply. You own $1 billion company? Aunt Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. $2 billion, I corrected. As of last quarter's valuation. Uncle Richard sank back into his chair. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I said. Every family gathering you talked about Morrison Construction's success, about the big contracts and impressive profits. But you never asked about my work beyond dismissing it as computer stuff. But you drive that old car, my cousin David said weakly. Because it's reliable and paid for, I replied. I prefer to invest in assets that appreciate rather than depreciating luxury items. James looked around the table with obvious disappointment. I have to say, I'm surprised by your family's reaction. Sarah is one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the region. Her company has been featured in Forbes, Tech Weekly, and Business Journal. She's won 3 industry innovation awards this year alone. We didn't know, my mother said, tears in her eyes. Because you didn't want to know, I said gently. When I tried to explain my work, you changed the subject. When I mentioned successful projects, you assumed I was exaggerating. You saw what you expected to see, the unmarried niece without an obvious career path. Uncle Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Sarah, I need to apologize. I had no idea. You had no idea because you never looked beyond your assumptions, I interrupted. For 3 years, I've been quietly ensuring Morrison Construction's success while you credited it to superior family management. James checked his watch. I should let you all get back to your dinner. Sarah, I'll email you those contract revisions tomorrow. Actually, I said, I think we need to discuss the Henderson project timeline. Of course. Should I call your office Monday? That won't be necessary. I opened my purse and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table in front of Uncle Richard. I think it's time for more transparent communication between our companies. Uncle Richard picked up the card with shaking hands. The thick, expensive cardstock read, Sarah Morrison, CEO Nexus Solutions, with my direct phone number and email address. This is really your company? He whispered. One of them, I said. Nexus Solutions is my primary business, but I also own Morrison Tech Consulting and Riverside Properties. Morrison Tech Consulting? My cousin Michael asked. That's the company that's been handling our IT upgrades. And Riverside Properties owns the office building where Morrison Construction leases space, I added quietly. The silence stretched on until James cleared his throat. Well, this has been enlightening. Sarah, I'll speak with you soon about expanding our partnership. After James left, the family sat in stunned silence. The children's laughter from the living room seemed to come from another world. Sarah, Uncle Richard finally said, I don't understand. If you own these companies, why didn't you just tell us? I sat back down, suddenly feeling exhausted. Because I wanted to see if my family could respect me for who I am, not what I own. But we always respected you, Aunt Margaret protested weakly. No, you tolerated me, I corrected. There's a difference. You saw an unmarried woman approaching 30 with no obvious career success, and you felt sorry for me. You offered me entry-level positions at Morrison Construction like you were doing charity work. My cousin David leaned forward. Sarah, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing if you'd bothered to ask real questions instead of making assumptions, I said. When I mentioned working on large-scale project management, you assumed I meant small business consulting. When I talked about software development, you assumed I meant basic computer repair. Uncle Richard rubbed his forehead. What can we do to make this right? I looked around the table at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. These weren't bad people, but they were small-minded people. They'd built their entire identity around a construction company that, without my intervention, would have failed 2 years ago. You can start by acknowledging that success comes in many forms, I said. You can stop assuming that because someone doesn't follow your prescribed path, they're automatically failing. We can do that, my mother said quickly. And you can stop offering me entry-level positions at Morrison Construction like you're doing me a favor, I continued. If you want to discuss business partnerships between our companies, we can do that as equals. Uncle Richard nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always have a place in the family business. I smiled sadly. Uncle Richard, I already have a place in the family business. I've been keeping it profitable for 2 years. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking increasingly detailed questions about my companies and accomplishments. It was surreal watching them try to reconcile their assumptions with reality. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children to leave, Uncle Richard approached me privately. Sarah, I owe you more than an apology, he said. I owe you my business. Without your help. Without my help, Morrison Construction would have lost the Patterson account and probably folded within 18 months, I finished. But that's not why I helped. Why did you? Because you're family, I said simply. Even when you didn't treat me like family, you're still my uncle. I wasn't going to let the family business fail just to prove a point. Uncle Richard's eyes filled with tears. What happens now? I considered the question carefully. Now we move forward with honest communication. Morrison Construction can continue using Nexus Solutions software and consulting services, but as a paying client, not as a favor to family. And the family relationship? That depends on whether you can see me as Sarah the CEO instead of Sarah the disappointing niece. 6 months later, I sat in the boardroom of Morrison Construction, reviewing quarterly reports with Uncle Richard and my cousins. The family business was thriving under a new partnership structure that acknowledged my company's contributions while maintaining Morrison's independence. These efficiency numbers are incredible, my cousin Michael said, studying the latest productivity reports. We're operating at levels I never thought possible. That's what happens when you implement proper project management systems, I replied. Technology amplifies good management and exposes bad management. Uncle Richard looked up from his reports. Sarah, I need to ask you something. What? That night at Christmas dinner when I cut you off from the family business. Did you know James was coming? I smiled. James always visits his parents on Christmas. They live 3 blocks away. And yes, I knew he'd probably stop by to drop off those contracts. So you planned it? I planned to let you make your announcement without interference, I said. What happened after that was just timing. My cousin David laughed. You let us hang ourselves. I let you reveal who you really were, I corrected. Just like I revealed who I really was. Uncle Richard shook his head in amazement. You know what the strangest part is? What? You were never the family disappointment. We were disappointing you. As I drove home that evening in my reliable 10-year-old car, I reflected on the journey from that Christmas dinner to this boardroom meeting. My family had needed time to adjust their perspective, to see beyond their assumptions and acknowledge reality. Some relationships were worth rebuilding even when it meant starting from scratch. Even when it meant proving yourself to people who should have believed in you from the beginning. But the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't about family dynamics or business success. It was about patience. The patience to let people reveal themselves completely before deciding whether they deserved a place in your future. Uncle Richard and my cousins had chosen to grow and adapt. They'd acknowledged their mistakes and worked to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect. And sometimes that was enough. Some people might call it deception. I called it strategy. The next morning, I woke up in my modest apartment, made coffee in my simple kitchen, and prepared for another week of running my hospitality empire from behind the scenes. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Thank you for the most perfect day of my life. I love you. I smiled and got back to work. Because this was who I was. Emma Thompson, the quiet sister who drove an old Honda and lived below her means. Who also happened to own a $2.8 billion empire and had just thrown the wedding of the year. Some secrets were worth keeping.